Sri, can you also give me...
Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a second. Thanks for your patience on that one. I hope everyone is able to get a coffee refill or a tea, depending on what time zone you're joining us in. A few quick housekeeping things while everyone rolls in. These sessions are being recorded and they will be posted on the VMUG YouTube. I'll drop the link shortly in the chat so everyone has those. It's also in the lobby chat as well for the session one. And session two will be added as soon as we're able, so probably by tomorrow. This is our second session of today. Thanks for everyone for joining the first one. I know it's a little early if you were on the west coast of the US, so I hope that you were able to join or watch the recording. We've got Shri Das on. Shri is a senior staff architect and a technical product manager at Broadcom, responsible for the architecture and design of various customer reference designs. We also have Hugo. Hugo's a vSphere Kubernetes Service lead in the VCF Technical Product Solutions architecture team based in London. And they're going to be architecting the private cloud and designing patterns for deploying and consuming VKS. So, Shri, I'll give it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Erika. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sri Das, and joining with my friend Hugo Fan, we'll go over the architecting the private cloud design pattern and deploying VKS on VCF. I think you have gone through Jad's session today, and you had given a complete end-to-end view of how VKS and Kubernetes ecosystem is working with VCF. But in this session, you will learn about like how do you design it, right? What is the foundational element required to journey on that path, right? So let's look at the agenda of what we're going to cover. So we'll go over a little bit around how industry has been evolved and what we have done so far. And you mostly, anybody using VMware so far, you know what are the paths are and how you consumed your workloads since 25 years ago or until today, right? And what is VCF services? This session is going to be talked about on VKS. We'll touch on VCF services. Jad did a good job, already set the foundation around that, but I'll just go and just rephrase what are the VCF services and how VKS fits into that. And then we'll talk about prerequisites for a private cloud consumption. What does that mean, right? What are the prerequisites you need to deploy and consume your VKS services on this private cloud platform? There's certain prerequisites. We'll talk about supervisor, some network options, and some other things. So we'll talk about supervisor design choices. That's another prerequisite consideration for your design patterns when you deploy VKS on VCF. And then we'll go various use cases around that, like you have a single organization or multiple organization. How do you consume a VKS? How do you design it? And then my friend Hugo will come in and talk about in detail around the VKS, how you can map it to the public cloud, with private cloud, what is the model looks like. Moving on. Okay. So most of you know, right? There are three paths you have been using VMware products and technologies so far. One is vCenter. If you have a standard IT operating in a silos environment or using everything, your workload and your VI admin or your even end user, they're using vCenter and deploying a couple of VMs, right? And there are certain larger enterprises who needs agility and rapidly deploying workloads and everything. That's where they're using a VRA, which is vRealize automation with your vCenter as your endpoint, deploying your workloads and consuming those. And there's another set of customers who are very much service provider who is using BCD to deploy the workloads and consume the workload for their tenants, right? Now, as you have seen on before, right? Now on the right-hand side, we have a VCF. Now everything is converging to one modern private cloud platform, which is VCF, right? And that VMware Cloud Foundation is not only a single platform, think about this as a private cloud when you talk about it provides your a self-service portal mechanism, right? If you wanted to do that, or you really want multiple modern services which can be consumed through that platform. So when you say modern services, it may be a private AI, it may be a DSM data services, right? Or you can have your own Kubernetes services, which we're talking about today, can be used through that modern private cloud platform, right? You already know the vSphere, vSAN, and NSX. These are core infrastructure components we have been using since day one. And those three components is part of that platform, which keeps you the layer open, giving the governance, giving the multi-tenancy, blueprints, workload optimization. All those components is now built up in certain way. Like we mentioned before, right? It is not an integrated product anymore. It is a truly platform which will give you an end-to-end view of VMware Cloud Foundation, where you consume all your workload, either a traditional workload, what you have been doing today, like just deploying a VM. Yes, you can do that, but you are getting many other capabilities what VCF is going to provide as a private cloud. Same time, we'll talk about VKS today. Moving on, before I touch on VKS, right? Like, what is exactly VKS? So you must have heard so many languages and everything before. The terminologies has been changed a lot of times. Yes, we know we are not good at the naming yet, but now we're standardizing all those things, right? The VKS is a service, part of VCF services, right? These are the VCF services think about this is like a purpose built, right? This services will help you enhance your modern application delivery for your end users or your cloud consumption, right? Each services has its own lifecycle management, like allowing you to deploy, upgrade, and remove without affecting your overall environment or infrastructure, right? Who is managing that? So you as a person, as a platform engineer, you coming in, you're deploying a services, you can go at a scale, right? You can deploy all the services on your scheduled time versus you are impacting entire infrastructure baseline if somebody is a cloud admin is managing, right? So there's a bunch of services which we have, and the services keep growing, right? But the runtime services, which we'll talk about today, mostly you will use your platform engineers or your end user going to use VKS, VM services, vSphere support services as part of built-in with VCF. You must have seen VMware always VM, right? But now you can come in this modern runtime services where you can run as a VM service, where VM can be run in a own namespaces, right? You can have a VKS, you can have a pod services as smaller containers, right? All these services are available. And the right-hand side, you can see there are a lot of other services we are now increasing on multiple other services like Harbor, Argo CD for your CI/CD, right? Valero for backup, right? The multiple services coming into that onto VCA platform. So moving on, now we talked about what are the services. Now let's talk about like, if I really wanted to consume a VKS part of this VCA, what are the things I need to do? As a platform engineer, what I need to understand, or even how do I work with my cloud admin or a infrastructure architect to lay that foundation, right? The critical component of your private cloud consumption is first three things. So for vSphere supervisor. So I'll talk about vSphere supervisor in a bit. And then there's two other components, right? You have a choice in VCF. You can use a modern networking with VPC, right? Which is our private cloud consumption model. Or you can still continue using the VDS, what you have been using so far, right? We support both. And the load balancer, there's a multiple options available there. Like if you are just starting up and consuming your container and VKS journey, yes, we have a couple of load balancer choices. Let's look at it, like what are the choices you have in next slide. But let's understand what is supervisor, right? Supervisor is not a VKS. A lot of time I hear that, oh, supervisor is just a VKS. No, VKS is a service. Supervisor is a platform layer, which a vSphere supervisor is just when you enable that, it basically creates another set of abstract on your ESX, which turns a Kubernetes-based declarative API where you can go use all the services part of that supervisor services. Without supervisor services, we cannot deliver a VCF services. So think about supervisor services. Supervisor transforms your VCF into a unified platform capable of running VMs, container, Kubernetes clusters, all managed through a single declarative API. So that's called supervisor. Okay, so I just want to reiterate that supervisor is not a VKS. So, okay, what are the choices when you deploy a supervisor, and what are the things you need to understand, and how and when you'll consume what services, right? Okay, through NSX. So NSX is a VCF networking platform, right? A platform level. It supports both VPC and classic mode. So if you have an NSX customer, you must be knowing that there's NSX Classics available when NSX came out. Now we are bringing in 9.0 onwards. It was there, VPC was there before, but 9.0 was most integrated product with vCenter. Now you can go and configure a VPC. We support both VPC and classic mode. And with VDS, you can have also VDS through vCenter where you can use. So when and how you'll use it, that's another thing I wanted to highlight. So if you're using a VCF automation, fully self-service governance policy, where you wanted to consume all your services, then definitely NSX VPC is the path where you will go and consume your VKS cluster, right? But if you really wanted to a single organization and you don't have a option right now to go with a self-service, full-blown private cloud, and you are still going to use VDS, if you have a certain network constant, yes, we do support that as well. And there's a two load balancer component comes into picture. If you're using any of the network choices, you can use NSX default, your load balancer, or you can use a foundational load balancer or AVI load balancer. So AVI load balancer is what we support today. And if you are the customer, if you have a AVI Essential, you need to go to Enterprise. That's what we are recommending, that because that's where you'll get L4, L7 load balancing capability with AVI. These are the choices you have when you deploy or architect your supervisor before even you consume VKS. Okay, moving on. Okay, let's take a look like how do you design a supervisor, right? So I'll go through a little bit in a high level summary view, not in a click on each component. Okay, now we have a shared management workload or dedicated management workload. Okay, in shared management, you have a single cluster, a very small cluster, 3-4 node, right? You usually wanted to try it out. Okay, I wanted to share my management workload both in the same cluster. So if you know the zone, right? Zone is nothing but it's a high availability zone. Think about in a AWS, you have a availability zone 1, zone 2, right? Now we are mapping it to a cluster level, right? In the given example, if you have a cluster in West Coast and that cluster is now going to serve your workloads and your control planes, you can definitely segregate that part of that cluster and create a high availability zone or fault domain around that cluster. And now in this example, I given a very simple layman view that one is you are going to share one cluster, your management workload and customer workload. Another one is a dedicated cluster where you are segregating your management workload and customer workload differently. And why you need this? Because you need a more high availability or you need a resiliency on your fault domain, right? In that case, you'll definitely going to deploy multiple clusters, multiple zones in multiple locations, maybe, right? In that case, both the options is available and it is completely supported. Now let's go a little bit deeper, right? So as I mentioned before, right, supervisor doesn't equal to VKS. Now, before you deploy a VKS service on this platform, there are a few other options available. Okay, single cluster, single control plane VM. So when supervisor get deployed, it's also deploys as own control plane VMs. It's also a Kubernetes, right? It's also use similar construct of Kubernetes, how it deploys. So you have a control plane. So in this example, on the first one, you have a vCenter. Now you have a single vSphere zone, single cluster. You may just starting up, right? I just wanted to learn. I wanted to just do a dev test, right? You can just start a vSphere supervisor and a single control plane VM. Yes, it supports. You can just deploy it, but do I need to deploy in an enterprise grade in a production workload? No, you just do the dev and test. I will not recommend that you deploy on a single control plane, deploy your running production workloads, right? And another one, right? The second one is you have a single cluster and you have a 3 control plane VMs, okay? That single cluster in a single zone. Now I can deploy a 3 control plane VMs where I can also deploy my workloads as I showed before another slide. You can deploy 3 VMs, control plane VMs, and you can also share same cluster for your workload, which is perfectly fine. Now you have more availability and more resiliency in your control plane. If your one control plane dies, they have another 2. But if your complete cluster dies, then everything is died, right? So now you have 3, another one. So you have 3 clusters, which is zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. Now you are separating each control plane to deploying in each cluster, each zone, right? Now you have more availability in across region or across data centers, right? You can have that 3 control planes segregating on different locations. So now, if you have now you understood how I deploy and design my control plane and zones in a cluster. Now I wanted to deploy a workload and I wanted to consume those workload part of this, my design. So give an example, one example, 3 management zones with a combined workload zone. So now you have 3 clusters, right? You have a vCenter, you have a networking, you have a cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3. Now, what I did is cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3 is associated to each zone, maybe different locations, right? And now my CPVMs is pinned to each location. Now I'm going to consume VKS. I go and create a namespace. You must be knowing that Kubernetes has a namespace construct that's also maps to your vSphere namespace. And that vSphere namespace is nothing but exactly similar to namespace what Kubernetes has. It's just a resource pool or where you manage your governance and policy around on namespace, or what control you wanted to give your end user to work on that inside namespace. Now VKS cluster is deployed on that namespace, right? Now, if you look at that, namespace is basically going horizontally across the zones. Now, you have a choice that your VKS clusters can be deployed across the board of any zone, right? Your workload 1, 2, 3 may be running on a cluster 3, another workload running maybe cluster 1. You have a full choice to span that namespace into 3 clusters, 3 zones, and you can run your VKS cluster in a scalable manner, right? Similarly, vSphere, there's another namespace B and C. We are now tagging that vSphere parts. Now you have a smaller container, you just create another namespace, and maybe that is going to be staying in a cluster 1. So think about this way, right? You have cluster 1 has a GPU, and you really wanted to run some workloads on cluster 1, not going to zone 1, zone 2, and cluster 2, and cluster 3. So you have full flexibility how you wanted to consume and workload and tag and other things around that platform itself. Now, a little bit more scale and a little bit more enterprise grade, high availability, and how you deploy things, right? Now you have a 3 management zone in an isolated workload zone. So now here we have a data center wide deployment where I wanted to run 1,000 or 10,000 of applications, right? And my enterprise spans across the data centers, across the regions, across the maybe countries, right? In here, maybe I can deploy my control plane VMs in different clusters, and those clusters are dedicated for only my management plane, right? Which is my supervisor control plane. And maybe I have few other clusters are dedicated for only workloads. So there is a completely isolation between your management plane and control plane. Management plane and workload plane. So your workloads are running everything on cluster 4, cluster 5, and 6. They are now isolated from your management. So you can segregate the way you want and completely supported part of your high availability, your resiliency, your region specific, anything you really want on your VKS to be consumed and deployed. Now let's go a little bit deeper around how do you go as a single enterprise versus a multiple enterprises, right? We talked about a foundational component, right? And the foundational components gives you and helps you design and architect a VKS deployment story. How do I consume? How do I design it, right? Let's understand the consumption summary, right? If you are a vCenter customer or you want to, when you use VCF automation, when you use vCenter, right? I'm a single enterprise and I'm very small retail store, give an example. And that retail store doesn't need a full-blown self-service. Maybe that the platform engineer itself has PUE end users who is deploying their workloads as a Kubernetes, right? In this case, you may not need a self-service portal, but you can create your own self-service with VKS, right? You can do that, but natively not built in with vCenter, right? But conjunction interface is your same vSphere UI, or you can use vSphere API, right? And platform engineer can also use same vSphere UI and VCF CLI for Kubernetes, right? To consume those services what we're mentioning for part of VKS. Tenancy support, now give an example, if you have only BU or a single IT enterprise, you don't need a tenancy, right? So you can just create one cluster, deploy everything, and I'm good with that, right? Resource and governance for vCenter, you can create your own resources, which is like your RBAC policies or security, SSO, IDM, all those things you can bring in part of the VCF, but certain things is not part of the vCenter directly, right? And network options, yes, through VDS, you can consume that similar network. You don't need to change your network. Maybe you have been using VDS and you have certain network requirements. You can continue using that same VDS. Now, we also introduced VPC in a 9.0, which in a vCenter. So you can, if you have a very enhanced customer or very going a modern way, you can definitely go and try out VPC side by side too, right? So vCenter provides now enabling a VPC construct, and you don't need to go to NSX manager to configure those things what you used to be before. Or you can transition to VPC if you're doing a net new customer, right? Both the paths are available with vCenter, VDS or VPC. On the right-hand side, if you have a custom VC automation, now think about you have deploying a scalable solution, you have a multi-tenancy, right? Or you have need a governance and policy. Oh, I need an approval for certain workload needs to be deployed. My platform admin needs to be approved certain governance and policy. Everything is inbuilt part of VCF automation, right? You use VCF UI, or you can use a VCF API, automation API for consumption interface. Your platform engineer can use similar UI and APIs, or even they can use VCF CLI. But this is kind of built in for your multi-tenancy, right? Think about you have a Coke and Pepsi model, right? Where you give a couple of namespaces and workloads for a tenant. And same cluster, you can have another resource, and Pepsi is consuming same resources on different manner, completely isolated from a one tenant to another, right? These are all out of box already there, but the network option is only VPC. You can't have a VDS to consume that services part of your multi-tenancy and governance and self-service. You have to use VPC on the day one. So that's your decision metrics, right? In day one, if you know that I really wanted to have a multi-tenancy capability, all these features, then definitely when you deploy your platform, supervisor, and network, then I will recommend that you should use VPC. And when you use VPC, if you go back to the previous slide, we talked about load balancer. Then you have an option too. When you use VPC, you should also choose, I wanted to use a NSX load balancer natively, or I should use a AVI load balancer for my L4 and L7. The foundational load balancer is supported with vCenter. You can use it, or you can use AVI, right, if you wanted to. But these are your design choices when you're going to look at a broader set of architecture and decision metrics when you're going to deploy. How it looks like, right? So if you understand the VCF construct, right, a management domain and workload domain, right? That's what we segregated on a VCF management and workload, right? So I'll not go into the fleet management, what is a VCF instance. I think multiple other sessions have been covered. But in an example of this is, okay, I'm running in a management domain, right? In the management domain, I have all management components. So vCenter is one of the example, right? Now vCenter is there on a management port group in VDS. Now I have spin off another workload domain where I wanted to enable supervisor and my VKS cluster, right? In this example, on the workload cluster, when you're deploying it, you have the two choices. You have a VDS or VPC that is the time you decide when you're creating a workload domain, and supervisor enabled process that will give you that choice. You decide that, and then you consume, right? But you are losing out some of the things, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Okay, let's take an example of a retail. I gave an example. You have a vCenter customer. This is a couple of stores, right? And now you wanted to go and consume certain applications for your end user, like self-checkout, right? Or pharmacy, analytics, right? Or computer vision, right? All these workload needs to run on VKS. These are all containerized, right? And you have been using it in some manner, right? Now think about the VKS is running all these application. This application needs to run a VKS, right? So if I go left to right, so left hand side, you have a central data center where basically your VCF stack is running, right? You have core services, maybe you have local DNS and NTP, or you may also have a replication between your DNS and NTP between your central site to your retail store, right? In that example also, you running your operation VCF automation if you wanted to, or even vCenter, right? That's what we're talking right now. So let's say example, in this example, vCenter is running your central site. And now you have a couple of stores where I want to run my VKS cluster, right? So you have a wide area network connectivity, right? Many of you know this, and all the traffic is running on over the one, right? And then on the local side, you may have a switches, maybe a top of the rack switches, or maybe one switches, two switches, depending on your requirement, depending on the store, right? It's a large, big box, or maybe a smaller store, right? And then you have a couple of hosts to form a cluster, right? In that cluster, maybe you're running a vSAN data store, and now I'm running a VDS as my all my networking capability around that cluster, right? That is where now I come in, I enable supervisor cluster on that cluster and create a zone, right? That's basically confirms that now I am ready to go consume or deploy my VKS on top of that, right? So once supervisor is there, then you basically going to enable supervisor services, which is a VKS, right? Once you do that, then you basically are able to consume all these applications what you're running on this VKS cluster. Now, if you look at the VM workload, there are certain VM workloads you can, in this platform supervisor, you can also run a couple of VM services VM, like Argo CD and Harbor, or any other inventory of stock, right? These are like couple of VMs maybe, or maybe you wanted to bring in a container, vSphere pod. You can run together in an namespace, right? So let's say, if in this example, I will have a VKS cluster in namespace 1, and I can also have a VM workload in namespace 2. And then you can map it out to which workload can go where. It's up to you. Your platform engineer needs to decide how that end-to-end view and deployment model looks like for their end user, right? And they can maintain that. So that's giving you how the architecture and design looks like in terms of a end-to-end VKS deployment part of a retail store, right? Now let's take a look on VCF automation, right? And now we talk about a few more things around, I have a multiple enterprises, like I talked about. I have single enterprise and multiple enterprises. How do I give that capability, multi-tenancy capability? Or I wanted to give a governance, right? I wanted to give a deployment portal for each end user or a tenant on that, right? So same example, I have a VCF automation now on management domain. And now I have only VPC choice. That's what I have to enable on my workload domain, and supervisor and VKS together to consume that VKS cluster part of VCF automation. VCF automation does the end-to-end deployment of your VKS cluster. Once you enable VCF automation with supervisor and VPC, you can log into VCF automation as a tenant, and you can just go and consume the services or deploy a VKS cluster in this cluster or this namespace. It will basically takes you there and deploys automatically everything. You don't need to do anything. It's simple, click, and easy, right? Let's take a look. In this example, I have one organization, and I really wanted to consume a VKS part of a namespace. So as I mentioned, you have a management domain, you have a BCF automation, right? And that BCF automation is basically calling all the endpoints of workload vCenter and NSX, right? And also integrated with BCF operation fleet manager capability, right? Now, I have one cluster only. You can have multiple clusters. But in this example, I have one cluster, one zone. I mentioned before, right, how supervisor deploys. And this is your design. The first page of design, you need to go through how is my cluster laid out, what is my zone laid out, and my supervisor laid out, right? Once you decide that, so in this example, I'm just picking up one example, BCP1 with one zone and my supervisor running on that cluster, right? Now I have blue namespace and green namespace. Blue namespace, I'm running in a VM, and green namespace, I'm running in a VKS cluster. Now, if you look at the VPC I have here, one VPC, but I have multiple subnets, right? This subnet is a private RFC 1918 you can use, right? Or you can use a public subnet, depending on your IP spaces, IP block, what your enterprise IT admin or in a CSP environment, a provider admin can help give those IPs to the tenant, right? You can use those part of your deployment. And you can have a single TGW, or you can have a multiple TGW. This is a transit gateway. Think about in a public, when you're going to AWS, you're clicking on a TG. This is your entry and exit point for your tenant space, right? Now, if you use NSX overlay, so you must have known the T0, which is provider gateway, right? Right. So the T0 is your basically north and south traffic. So T0 and TGW works together depending on what services when you're using it, right? If you are using a VPN services or certain services, you can have a T0, right? And then all the services, NAT services and everything on T0 and TGW works together, right? Now, in this example, think about this, right? Your workload running on a green namespace where VKS running. This is using a green subnet. The VM who is running in blue namespace, they're using a blue subnet. In this is a single organization. Think about it as an IT organization, different views, right? Sales and finance. And you segregated, okay, the finance guy is only using VM and my sales or HR guy is using a VKS cluster for certain operation for the sales operation, right? So this is one of the example for your single enterprise with multiple organization inside. They are running in a very easily consumable networking end-to-end view of a design footprint for a VKS consumption. But now if you go a little bit further, multi-tenancy, if I have a multiple organization, now I'm a CSP, I have a blue organization and green organization. I wanted to give a end-to-end isolation on network layer, as well as my compute layer and storage layer, right? But in terms of your supervisor, right, it's already part of three clusters, and each cluster has multiple nodes. And each cluster has a zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. It's mapped to each cluster. Now my supervisor running on 3 zones. Now I have a blue organization. I can bring my multiple network isolation end-to-end to consume that VKS cluster. In this example, if you can see that VPC blue is dedicated for a dedicated for an organization blue. And same thing, the TGW, VPC, and subnet, everything is dedicated for that customer and nothing is routed to your other T0, which is a provider gateway for your north and south traffic, right? So now what I created is organization green. So each organization blue and organization green, you can see that it has a self-managed or platform managed or tenant managed services, including VKS with network services, part of that services, right? On VCF automation, orchestrate everything, part of your governance policy, multi-tenancy, airbag, right? All those things can be done part of your VCF automation. These things you cannot do with vCenter, right? This is what the difference between is, right? How important for you for security compliance, right? Auditing, all those things require your decision choice when you deploy your VKS part of VCF. Moving on. I'll just give one example here. How do you deploy it, right? Deployment of a architecture always critical, right? This is one of the example how you consume. I use VPC as one of the example, but you can change that to VDS if you wanted to. But think about when you day zero, right? You bring on your environment of VCF. These are the components which comes out, right? Your vCenter, SDDC manager, operation, automation, NSX manager. This is your management domain where the cluster one comes out, right? That's your cluster one you dedicate for your management domain. And that also requires certain networking capabilities where you give your network information to deploy those management components, right? And now you see upstream network, that's your routing capability, north and south, you're doing it, and you may creating a multiple VLANs and associating those to particular VCF deployment requirement like vMotion, vSAN, and ESX management, plus management network for your all the management component VMs, right? On the right-hand side, now you're creating a workload domain, right? On this workload domain, you have a choice that I wanted to deploy a VPC modern-based private cloud. You have a choice that you can use a T0 and TGW and VPC. And VPC is now particularly what I wanted to highlight, that it is now integrated part of your vCenter. The way you use vCenter 25 years ago until today, you now can log into vCenter and configure a VPC and then use that VPC to deploy a supervisor, and you can create multiple VPCs for specific requirement, right? And each VPC can give you multiple subnets, either private subnet or public subnet. You can hook that up to a VPC. And you have a choice to how you want to taking your traffic back to your upstream network. You can use your TGW and T0 to go back and forth. We now support CTGW, which is central transit gateway model, or distributed transit gateway model. So I would recommend that on this session, I'll not cover CTGW and DTGW. We have multiple design patterns in VCF design guide. I would rather request that go and take a look at those designs. You can use those for any TGW deployment part of your this design, right? Once you have this underlying architecture and design and deployment is ready, then VKS consumption is just a few buttons click on a VCF automation or even vCenter. You can go to vCenter catalog services, enable your VKS cluster. With that, I would just wanted to highlight a few things. What exactly are your Kubernetes services, right? It is an integral part of your VMware Cloud Foundation, right? VKS has a flexible deployment architecture, what I mentioned to you right now. VKS has VDC and VPC-based network options, and VKS is enhanced by VCF automation integration. You can start your journey, crawl, walk, run. You can start with your vCenter. You can deploy your workload similar way, and slowly you can go and use VCF automation for your enhanced experience or enhanced automation around that integration for VCF automation. With that, I will hand over to my friend Hugo. We'll cover the in detail on the ecosystem around
the consumption. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sri. Before we go into my area, can we cover some of the questions? Because these are quite relevant to your area. They were mainly around the architecture. So first question we had was, we know it's not supported to run VCF Automation 9 inside of a VCF fleet in a single site with a minimal footprint on the same vSphere cluster. So does VCF need to be deployed in a separate vSphere cluster? And is that going to change in 9.1, Sri?
So VCF, let me understand the question right now, right? If you have a single site, single fleet, you can able to deploy VCF, but VCF automation goes on same fleet. You don't have a choice to decouple VCF automation to deploy multiple fleets, if that is the question.
It's around if they deployed a single site with a minimal footprint.
Yeah. So you can start with minimal footprint, and you can have a multi-cluster node on same fleet that is fully supported.
Thanks, Sri. I'm getting a bit of an echo in my audio, which is kind of weird. I'll fix it in a minute. There was another question. For supervisor, where it's possible to deploy one control plane VM, does that still also need a dedicated 3-node vSphere cluster as a minimum configuration?
Yes, you can deploy one host or 2 node if you're just using a vCenter, and you can enable supervisor on a single host or 2 node or 3 node. And if you are using a single control plane, that means you must be looking for a single host or 2 node, right? Yes, we have certain edge patterns. If you look for the VCF edge design details, you will see those design patterns are covered. But however, for your VCF automation, right, or full-blown enterprise you're deploying, then I will recommend that 3-node is minimum. But we support 1 node and 2 node with one control plane per host. That should be fine.
Awesome. There was another question. Is it possible or supported to run VCF automation without VPCs via NSX Classic mode?
Okay. The VCF automation, if you are doing a net new and you really wanted to consume a modern cloud where with VKS as a service, then VPC is must. But VCF automation also has a VM app capability. The VM app is nothing but just deploying a VM. Like think about it's ARIA automation, the old days, right? VCF automation is now a product which converged ARIA automation and BCD together. It's now becoming a VCF automation. But ARIA automation customers has been using a VM app technology, which is part of the VCF automation umbrella. We didn't change anything. So the entire ARIA automation component, what you have been using, if you'll upgrade to VCF automation, you'll definitely see as a VM app, or you can go and enable a VM app and as a greenfield deployment. If you use VM app, yes, you can use NSX Classic, you can use BDS and VPC both, but only VM. But however, for VKS, what we're talking about here, we don't support VKS consumption through NSX Classic. It's only required VPC.
Thanks, Sri. I think we're okay with those questions. So running low on time, I did have some slides to cover VKS consumption, but we are covering these subjects in the follow-up sessions with Miles and myself. So we will be covering CI/CD. We'll cover a lot of the VCF services, so Harbor, Argo CD, and so on. So we'll cover some of this in the follow-up sessions and hope to see you there. Back to you, Erica.
Thank you both. I know this is a lot of content in a short period of time, so appreciate everyone hanging with us for it. Thank you very much, Sri, for this today, and for those who are in the Q&A and chat. A couple of housekeeping things. We'll go right back to the lobby. The next session will start in a little over 10 minutes, so everyone can refill again, take care of themselves, and then we'll see you right back. This was being recorded, and we will get the recordings up in that playlist that I linked, and I'll continue to link them in future sessions. So thank you all so much. Appreciate the time for the speakers today, and see you in a couple minutes.